Yesterday. My name is Dr. Negar Shekarabi. I'm a staff psychologist and the outreach coordinator at UC Irvine's Counseling Center, and I'll let Tina introduce herself.
Can y'all hear me? Hi everyone, I'm Tina Auon. I'm the director of the Middle Eastern Student Center at UCR, and thank you for having me today.
So we'd like to today spend some time talking a little bit more about our Middle Eastern student populations and how on our university campuses we can be more supportive of their needs, both on the mental health realm, but also in student affairs and in terms of campus connectedness and support. So I'm going to spend some time talking a little bit about just sort of setting the stage and getting us all kind of on the same page about some information about the Middle Eastern population and Middle Eastern students specifically. And then really I'm excited to have Tina talk a lot more about the Middle Eastern Student Center at UC Riverside and their inception and their programming that they do there, and a lot of exciting things coming out of UCR. So our hope today is to disseminate some information that's going to help in general for those of us, depending on where we are and our level of knowledge about the Middle Eastern population, feel like we know a little bit more, or at least we're reminded of some things that we already know to keep in mind when working with this population clinically, but also on campus and in other roles. Talking a little bit more about how identity development, oppression, international affairs, stereotyping, minority stress can impact our Middle Eastern students, and understanding and exploring how intersections of multiple identities can impact our Middle Eastern students as well. So as we have these discussions, one thing I always want to start with is just a reminder that acculturation matters when we're talking. So some of the things that I might talk about and some of the studies that have been found, keeping in mind that level of acculturation impacts all of that. And because particularly with Middle Eastern students, we have such a wide array of immigration status and acculturation level, something that may be true for a Middle Eastern student who immigrated when they were 4 with their family may not be true for an international student from Saudi Arabia who's here for their first quarter, keeping those kinds of differences in mind. So I like to start out with where is the Middle East? What do you guys think? This is a map of, I think, a generally agreed upon part of the world that we would all say is the Middle East, but what countries would you not include and what countries would you include in your definition of Middle East? Anyone want to take a stab at it? Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, Syria, Jordan.
I guess I don't tend to think of India.
Okay, not India. Afghanistan. Would anyone include India? Any differing? Okay, so we're agreeing on that generally. Okay. So in the next slide, I have sort of one common way that we might think about the Middle East that includes Egypt. And then, but, if we look up when we start getting into Eastern European countries, would not include those countries and would not include India, but would include Pakistan maybe. And then another way of looking at it that would not include Pakistan would not include Egypt. And I think part of why, and I'm sure there's other variations too, we could do all kinds of circles on this map, but I think one thing, and Tina and I were just sort of talking about this, is there is no clear-cut definition of specifically what is or is not a Middle Eastern country. We have a lot of overlap where most of us generally agree, the media generally agrees, but then we've both worked with students who, for example, are Egyptian, who also identify very strongly as North African. Students who are Egyptian who very strongly identify as Middle Eastern. We talked a little bit about Armenian students that we've worked with that strongly identify as Middle Eastern, and some who definitely do not. And so I think what's helpful to me in this exercise is remembering that the label Middle Eastern doesn't tell us anything about a person other than what region of the world they or their family or their ancestry comes from. It doesn't tell us anything specific about their culture, their race, their religion, but it is a helpful term because there is a lot of shared cultural values in this part of the world. But just keeping that in mind, that it's a helpful umbrella term, but it doesn't tell you a lot of nuanced information about the person. Okay, so terminology a little bit, real quick and dirty terminology. So very often when we're talking about Middle Eastern students, we might find ourselves interchangeably using some of this terminology. And I think that's something we have to be really mindful of, because most of these terms are not interchangeably applicable. So Arab, for example, is an ethnic identity. So it may tell you a lot about the part of the world that someone or their ancestry is from and the language that they speak. It doesn't tell you anything about their religion. It doesn't necessarily tell you anything about their race. So keeping that in mind. Muslim, it will tell you something about the person's religious identification. Again, it doesn't tell you what country they're from. It doesn't tell you their ethnicity, and it doesn't tell you anything about their race. And there are a lot of, for example, Middle Eastern or Arab Americans who are not Muslim. There's a variety of religious identities in the Middle East, a lot of Christians, Jews, Baha'is, or Zoroastrians. But a lot of times we'll hear things like the Muslim world being used to refer to the Middle East, and it's not the same thing. So being mindful of that. We talked about Middle Eastern. I think my bias is that I think Middle Eastern is a very useful term because it doesn't tell us a lot. And I think when it doesn't tell us a lot, we are doing less of assuming and more of allowing our students to, who identify as Middle Eastern, then fill in the gaps for us. And then I have Persian and Iranian up here just because, at least in Southern California, we have a very large Iranian American population. In fact, there's nowhere else you can interact with more Iranians outside of Los Angeles except Iran. So there's a pretty high density of Iranians in Southern California, but we'll sometimes hear Persian and Iranian used interchangeably, and I think this is one where you can be pretty safe and use it interchangeably. Iranian and Persian, you'll hear Iranians refer to themselves as Persian or Iranian, and they essentially do mean the same thing. The word Persian is a little bit more of a callback to the culture, and Iranian is the nationality, but it's very commonly used interchangeably. I think as mental health providers or anyone who's working on campus with students, we have to be mindful of sort of the implicit messages that we get from the media. It's not uncommon for us as consumers of the media to be hearing a story about terrorism on the news while we're seeing a picture of Muslims praying in a mosque. And sort of the implicit connection that makes for us subconsciously and how that affects our views of the entire group, of the entire population. We're not immune to this connection happening just because we're mental health professionals. It's kind of seeping in for all of us, just like it does for everyone else that's a consumer of media. Sorry. And so the reason why that's important is we do know that since 9/11, negative attitudes toward Middle Eastern Americans has increased. In fact, there was a study that showed that the negative attitude toward Muslims also carried over to Middle Eastern Americans in general. Part of the reason is because of what I talked about. We're not always that great at knowing the difference. So they don't only present challenges, these stereotypes, for the Middle Eastern Americans themselves in terms of their development of a positive ethnic identity, but they also can lead to bias on the parts of those of us who are serving them. Mental health professionals, student affairs professionals. So I want to talk a little bit about some facts and things we do know about the Middle Eastern population. In terms of immigration, really broadly, we can think about it happening in a couple of waves, but they are one of the fastest growing immigrant groups in America. There's a lot of dramatic growth the last 30 years. So for example, in 1970, there was fewer than 200,000 Middle Easterners in the US based on the US Census. So it's not a perfectly accurate number. By 2000, that number had grown 650%. So by the year 2000, we had an estimate of 1.5 to 3 million, which is still a huge range of an estimate. And if we had more time, we'd talk a lot more about the census issues and why these are not really actually very accurate numbers. But in terms of immigration, really broadly speaking, we can think about immigration in two waves. The first wave was kind of the last quarter of the 19th century. 90% of this group was Christian single males between the ages of 15 to 45. The second wave happened after World War II and is probably continuing to the present time, though anecdotally I feel like there might be sort of like a new wave that we might be in. This immigration primarily was caused by needing to escape some kind of political turmoil in the homeland. So the reason behind the immigration in the second wave is a little bit different than the first wave. And this group is composed more of highly educated professionals. Now 45% of this group are female, 60% are Muslim. And it's a somewhat of an older group, 50% are between 20 to 49. Most Middle Eastern immigrants are settling in California, as you can see, but I think all over the country as well. But very similar to a lot of other immigrant groups who function as a diaspora, they're tending to immigrate together to areas of the country where they can be around other people that share their cultural and ethnic identity. By city, we're seeing Los Angeles and New York. And then just by population, a vast majority of Middle Eastern immigrants and Middle Eastern Americans are Arab American, but one thing to keep in mind is only 41% of them are foreign born. So close to 60% of the Arab American population is American born. And second, we have Armenian Americans, then Iranian Americans, and then the other smaller groups are made up of Assyrian Americans, Israeli Americans, Turkish Americans, and Afghan Americans. So things for us to keep in mind, generally speaking, is religious factors, communication factors. I'm going to talk about each of these a little bit more in depth. Family and affiliation factors, race and social class, and stereotypes. So a couple of things I want to say about the religious factors is keeping in mind that there's a lot of religious diversity in the Middle Eastern population. But in terms of immigration and settlement, you're seeing a lot of folks sort of in the diasporic model sort of cluster together in terms of trying to live in the vicinity where they can comfortably practice their culture and practice their religious beliefs with others and kind of recreating that cultural community. In terms of communication factors, I mean, I think we're thinking about all the nonverbal communication things that we keep in mind when we're learning about cross-cultural psychology. Middle Eastern Americans are probably high touch, eye contact is important, things like that to keep in mind. But also, there are some things that are very specific to Middle Eastern culture that are have less of a direct translation in terms of understanding them from a Western perspective. But the one thing I often talk about is this concept of tarof. That's an Iranian word, but it really doesn't have a direct translation in English. But it's a set of rituals and euphemisms and different types of things that people might engage in. That the purpose of them is to save face or to maintain dignity in the social interaction. So some examples that I'll often give is you're practicing tarof when you go to someone's home and they offer you something to eat and you say no thank you, and they offer you something to eat again and you say no thank you again, and they offer you something to eat again and you say no thank you again, but your host still brings you food and puts it in front of you. Both people in that scenario are practicing tarof. The guest is not right away accepting food that's offered to them because that would be interpreted as rude and too eager. And the host does not stop offering food because that would be interpreted as rude and not hospitable. So you might see this interaction play out for the entire visit and no food may be eaten by the end of this interaction, or it may be, but the point is that ritual happens almost subconsciously without anyone thinking about it pretty commonly. Another one is if we had all the chairs, for example, filled in this room, there was no empty chairs left and someone else joined us, someone in the back might get up and offer their chair to the person who came in. The person who came in would say, no, please, thank you, you sit, and wouldn't take the chair. And the person who offered the chair would keep insisting that they take the chair. And neither of them would probably sit, and they would both stand in the back of the room and leave one chair empty. But again, that's a way to preserve sort of respect for others and your own dignity, and kind of has the same process underlying it. Taarruf is the Farsi word for that, but I think culturally, a lot of Middle Eastern cultures share this sort of practice. And so one thing that comes to mind for me around that, in terms of working with clients clinically, again, keeping in mind level of acculturation. So I'll use myself as an example. I've been here since I was 4. I can very easily practice or not practice Taarruf depending on who I'm with. But for a student who's maybe an international student who that way of functioning socially is part of their worldview, I sometimes wonder in the clinical room what it's like when I make a recommendation or suggest that a student does something they don't want to do. They're often very not likely to directly disagree with me in session, and will often actually agree with me very vigorously that that's a good idea and they're going to do that. But what I'll see between sessions is what feels to me like non-compliance, but it's actually a way of disagreeing with me without actually disagreeing with me, and preserving that dignity. And kind of so being mindful of that and being able to have a conversation around how that might be playing out between the two of us. Also, I just want to say a few words about race. It's a really tricky subject. I think in the Middle Eastern population, I think within the Middle East, often individuals are not necessarily thinking about themselves in terms of race being very salient. There's other identity factors that are much more salient in the Middle East: religion, language, country of origin in terms of identity. But when Middle Eastern Americans and their families have immigrated to the United States, now they're also being asked to identify racially in some way or another. And it can be a really confusing process. One, because they may not know what their race is, or two, because they may have some sense of what they've been told their race is, but in terms of their lived experience in the United States, they may not feel like they get viewed or treated as that race. So Iranians, I'll use this another example, historically identify as Caucasian, but our lived experience, particularly after 9/11, has not been that, and that creates a lot of confusion in terms of my identity getting lost then when I'm asked to identify myself racially. There's been more and more of a movement for Middle Eastern Americans to check other and fill in Middle Eastern, or check other and fill in your ethnicity, but it still causes a little bit of confusion in terms of racial identity and where do I fit and where do I belong. I want to talk about a little bit about multiple identity. So I found one study that I thought was exciting, though, that looked at LGBT issues in the Middle Eastern community. So this study talked to a group of Middle Eastern, I think specifically Iranian LGB youth, and then a group of American LGB youth. What they found is some things they expected to find was that the Iranian LGBs did say that they experienced their host culture as holding more stigma or more stereotypes about their identity, their sexual orientation. They didn't differ too much, the two groups, in terms of measures of mental health and wellness. But there was a small subgroup of LGB Iranians that actually did much better on measures of mental health and wellness, and that was a subgroup of Iranians who were out to both of their parents. And so I think what the study was able to sort of lend some more support to is the importance of sort of that family support in communities and cultures that are more collectivistic, and what that actually looks like. So despite the fact that they experience their cultural group that they're affiliated with as a whole as a much more difficult group to be out with, if they were able to be out to both of their parents, they actually were doing quite well. But I think that also brings up a host of other concerns that not all Middle Eastern students are going to feel like they can, of course, be out to both their parents. And then I'm going to have us talk a little bit about, particularly as clinicians, and then we'll move over to thinking more broadly campus-wide when Tina shares, but specifically as clinicians, things to be mindful of in a clinical interaction when we're doing interventions with Middle Eastern students. So, there's the awareness and the knowledge and the skills piece I tried to kind of break this down into, but I think the awareness piece is really important, examining our own attitudes and beliefs, reflecting a little bit more on the messages we receive from the media and being a more critical consumer of the media, because it's affecting all of us and our views of the individuals we work with, and looking within ourselves for our own attitudes that might be harmful or not very growth promoting for the students we might be working with. The knowledge piece is, taking part in things like this, increasing your knowledge if you feel like there's areas you could know more or educate yourself more. But also seeking out experiences that enrich your perspective. And then the skills piece is the culturally relevant interventions, which is what I'm going to talk a little bit more specifically about. So I think things for us to keep in mind is Middle Eastern students are inclined to maintain their family ties. A lot of times when part of what we're working on with a student might be family relationships and dynamics that we can recognize are psychologically unhealthy or toxic for the student, depending on where we're coming from theoretically or our values clinically, we might be exploring with the student about setting boundaries and establishing boundaries between themselves and their family, and just being really mindful of how difficult that might be for some of our students to hear that message in terms of the and understanding what it might mean in their life when they're very much socialized to maintain family ties at all costs. Again, keeping in mind level of acculturation here, some Middle Eastern students may be reluctant to indulge in self-disclosure right off the bat. So thinking about that, that rapport building period may be a little bit longer in our clinical interactions with some of our Middle Eastern students. It may take more time to develop trust and have an effective treatment with them. The concept of shame, and I know there are other cultural groups that we all often work with as well that we're aware of, that shame is an important factor in terms of how the individual experiences their presenting concerns, the world around them, their relationships with people. And it's a very widely held and expressed concept in Middle Eastern culture as well, and so being mindful of that and how that might be associated to their presenting concern or just their experience of coming to therapy. Again, level of acculturation and geography here matters, but we might work with some students who may come from more rural areas, who are more recent immigrant students that aren't really educated a lot about our mental health system and what good mental health looks like. So they may not be very likely to seek out services, or if they do, they might need a lot of psychoeducation about what we can and can't do here together. There's a good degree of negative feelings regarding government and political institutions, especially depending on the reason why your student or their family may have immigrated. So I think understanding their immigration story, if they immigrated with their family or the generation before them did, is important to understand your student as well. But also keeping in mind that we as clinicians or we as a system or as a campus are very likely being interpreted by the student as a public institution. And so we represent that with them. And then this last point was just where another place I would have talked to you all about Tarof, but we already did that. I'm going to put all of these up, and then I'm going to highlight just a couple of the specific recommendations. In terms of inclusiveness, some of us in this room don't have much control over this piece, but we may have some influence around when we're gathering information about our clients. How inclusive are we being? What kind of categories are we including? I think now that we've all switched to PNC, we have the Middle Eastern category. So this was the first year I was able to actually get a count of this year how many Middle Eastern students came to the counseling center at UCI, and it's about 5% of our clients are Middle Eastern, or identifying as Middle Eastern by checking that box. And so watching that number over the next few years will probably be really helpful for me to get a sense of are we being underutilized, appropriately utilized, and that might help inform outreach and other types of things that we do. But I wanted to highlight a couple of things. We probably want to avoid the tendency to use individuation from family as an indication of psychological healthiness with this group. There may, for some of our clients, still be an individuation process, but it doesn't look like the individuation process we learned in our textbooks. Individuation may not have the same markers that we might be looking for, and so something that we might be interpreting as an enmeshed family dynamic may not really be that unhealthy in our students' experience. And just being mindful of avoiding a tendency to pathologize somatization behaviors. I think sometimes when we think about somatization, we think about it in terms of, because of the cultural stigma, for example, around mental health, this client might present with somatization symptoms, but also thinking about it as the somatization symptoms may be the depression. That is how it presents itself. It's not necessarily that it's hiding behind the somatic symptoms, but that for a lot of Middle Eastern individuals, the somatic symptoms are more primary in terms of how they might experience the anxiety or the depression, or in terms of the narrative and the language about mental health, it might be the symptoms that get talked about more readily than the other markers we typically look for, like sadness. And then specific for immigrant students, just very quickly, but I guess when you're thinking about our population, this would be more applicable to our international student population. Talking to students about this shift from a place where they were surrounded by a lot of friends and family to somewhere where they're much more isolated and alone, to help that conversation shape your understanding of their presenting problem. Also, in terms of socioeconomic shift, a lot of our immigrant students and their families are experiencing a very drastic socioeconomic shift in their immigration process, so understanding how that shift may be affecting their presenting issues or how they're functioning at school. How they're dealing with their ethnic minority status when they've previously been part of a majority. That can have a huge psychological impact as well. And also, again, understanding their immigration story or their parents' immigration story. Was there any trauma related to the immigration? And what was that whole process like? Or what is the narrative in your family that's been passed down about immigration, why we immigrated, how we immigrated? Because that shapes then the student's worldview, their understanding of maybe even why they're in school or why it's important to perform a certain way. I can, again, use in my family the example that the narrative I think that was very commonly passed down to my family is that my sister and I are the only reason we came to America. So knowing that since I was like 5 created some, even though that wasn't very much explained to me very much beyond that statement, I understood that what I do here was really important to everyone because it caused my family to leave everyone behind when they were like 35 and come to a new country. So it puts a different level of pressure on what's happening at any stage in my life, but I think colleges particularly, as they're emerging developmentally into adulthood, they start to think about that narrative a little bit more and why they're here. And then just lastly, because I think it's a good segue to Tina's talk, I wanted to talk a little bit more about a study I found that talked a little bit more about, Middle Eastern students' identity safe spaces on campuses specifically. So a few issues came up in this study that the students that were interviewed shared with the researchers. One was on campus, this sense of managing a potentially risky identity. And so what that meant, this is sort of speaking to that stereotype threat phenomenon. So a lot of the students that they talked to who identified as Muslim in this study had a lot of anxiety about if I'm practicing my religion on campus in a visible way, I now feel vulnerable to being interpreted through the lens of these negative stereotypes. So one student, for example, in this study talked about trying to find a quiet place on campus where she could pray 5 times a day, and her anxiety when she did that she looked sneaky. What's that girl doing? Why is she trying to go in a room by herself? And the anxiety that created around her ability to practice her religion on campus. Also, we know that when students are in an identity-threatening environment, they tend to achieve lower academically. And things that students identified as identity threatening were things even as simple as having professors that seemed to have negative views about Islam in class. They weren't directly directed to them, but it caused them to feel unsafe and threatened in their environment. And then the reverse of that an identity-safe environment enhances well-being and academic performance. So I had a couple of examples, but I think some of the things that the students identified that made their environment feel safe were really simple things, like having professors that seemed a little bit more open-minded, having spaces where they could easily practice their religion, a campus community that generally seemed supportive of their religious identity, but also having an identifiable Muslim student community on campus. And then also just keeping in mind, particularly in this study, understanding that gender, race, religion, and class intersect with Muslim identity and how each individual student's experience, depending on where they intersected on these other identity markers, was really different. So they spoke to a student in this study who was a Muslim female student who had very different experiences on campus than a African-American male Muslim student. He had very different experiences because of that intersection of religion and race for him. And so being mindful of those multiple identities and how they impact our students as well. And so I'm gonna, small comforts and acts of kindness was what I was just talking about just a second ago. I'm gonna transition over to Tina, and she's gonna talk a little bit more specifically about what's been going on at UCR, because I think it speaks directly to an identity self environment and how it can enhance the well-being of our students.
Good morning, everyone. How are y'all doing? Good. Before I start, I want to ask y'all a quick question. What are the first few words that come to mind when you hear the word Middle Eastern? You can shout them out, you can raise your hand. There's no right answer. So when you hear the word Middle Eastern, what are the first words that come to mind? Anything in particular? The Valley? The Valley. San Fernando Valley. Anything else? Conflict. Okay. Anything else? One more. No right or wrong answer. Okay, the Valley and conflict. Good enough. So at UCR, we served about 200 students, and of those 200 students, we had about 30 different words. If you can't believe that. Just 30 different words. And the words were not the best description of the Middle East or Middle Eastern students. So a few words were oil, war, terrorist, Muslim, desert, sand, shawarma, 2 points for that one, hummus, 2 points for that one, and one last word was Saudi Arabia. So that's a very limited view of how students perceive the Middle East. And this was directly translating to the terrible student experience of Middle Eastern students at UCR. So we decided to do something about it. We created the MESC, which is now the Middle Eastern Student Center. Fun fact, we're the only one in the UC system, and we're thought to be the only one in the country so far. There is a Muslim center at Stanford, but it doesn't function the same way that we do. So up until now, the MESC at UCR is the first in the country and the first in the UC system. Now I want to take you back to our roots, how we all started. The MESC was only founded 2 years ago, but before then, our work dates all the way back to 2009. So I'll tell you a little small story. 2009, I was a freshman at UCR, and I was the president of the Lebanese Social Club. And I thought I was doing a great job contributing to my community and bringing the students together. And I received an email from our former dean of students, Alfredo Figueroa, who said he wanted to assess the needs of the Middle Eastern community. So I was so excited to go to this meeting. I walk in a little bit late after a midterm, and I see there's only 3 students there. And of the 3 students, all 3 happen to be Muslim. So I walk in, I'm listening to their student experience, what they need on campus, how we can better support the Middle Eastern community. They talked a lot about halal food options, prayer spaces, a lot about potentially a counselor that could identify with Muslim or Middle Eastern needs. And then the vice chancellor and the dean of students looked at me after the 3 students spoke and said, and what are your needs as a Muslim woman? And I looked behind me and I'm like, oh, who else is here, you know? And they were talking to me, and I had my rosary on. And I was like, oh, I'm not a Middle Eastern woman, so I can't speak on behalf of a Middle Eastern woman. I'm a Middle Eastern Muslim woman, but I am a Middle Eastern Christian. And they were shocked. Like, they had never heard in their life that Middle Eastern Christians existed. So it was really tough as this freshman at UCR, seeing that administration had no idea that there was a religious diversity in the Middle East. So from that moment on, my three Muslim student friends and my peers, we all got together to advocate for the MESC. In about 2010, 2011, we began to advocate. We proposed to Chancellor Timothy White and began working with VC Jim Sandoval and Assistant Dean of Students Joe Verrata. 2011, 2012, we hosted the Laugh and Peace Comedy Show, which is a great show. It combined a very famous Muslim comedian named Ahmed, a rabbi, and a pastor. And three of them got together and did this really amazing skit. So the whole idea of this comedy show was to see, was there student buy-in? Did people care about Middle Eastern causes and issues? So our pilot program, we were just short of 600 people at that first event. And then we worked with the University Statistician to create and distribute a university-wide survey. Now, of course, as Negar said, we have huge issues with identifying as Middle Eastern. Up until now, the U.S. Census does not have any Middle Eastern category, and up until last year, students could identify as Middle Eastern on the UC application. So we really had to do our own grassroots work with the University Statistician, and get the ME category on just one survey. So I'll tell you about the survey results right after this. And then finally, we submitted a proposal to the Student Service Fee Advisory Committee, and they approved the establishment of the MESC. So now we're just 2 years old. So these are some questions that we asked in the campus climate survey. What ethnicity and race do you identify yourself as? Do you feel right at home at UCR regardless of diversity? And how often has faculty expressed negative or stereotypical views about your ethnic group, religion, or ethnicity? Now, these were the key questions we would need to ask students to see if there was a need for the center. Because the administration, of course, said we're not going to put in money into something that there's no need for. Do we know if there's 25 Middle Eastern students on campus or 2,500? So survey results found that about 4.5% of the undergraduate population was Middle Eastern. Now that number has jumped up to 6.2%. We found that 17.4% of Middle Easterns identified in the survey felt underrepresented at the UCR. And when you compare these numbers to Mexican Americans, only 1.98% felt underrepresented, and East Asians, 0.97% felt underrepresented. So an overwhelming statistic of 17.4 students felt underrepresented at UCR. And this is the shocker right here. 70.45% of Middle Eastern students have experienced negative or stereotypical views from the campus community. And that's shocking. And of course, I was in survey as well, so I could count, maybe on both hands, the number of times that I felt stereotypical views or racial discrimination on our campus. But to know that so many other students identified with that was absolutely overwhelming. So from this survey alone, the university said, we have to take action and we have to do this. And again, the following year, the center was created. So right before we created the actual space, we did a focus group of Middle Eastern students, talked about the Middle Eastern community, what are their needs, what are their issues on campus. So from 2010-2012, we saw that some of the needs were establishing a formal presence with the university, aka an MESC, discrimination, harassment, and stereotyping. Students felt underrepresented and misunderstood, and there was no community between Middle Eastern students. In 2012, we had about 16 Middle Eastern identified orgs, and there was no space for them to get together, to collaborate, to find each other, to work with the campus. And we had different centers. We have the Chicano Center, the African American Center, and things like that. But there was no specific place for a Middle Eastern community, and there was no staff person that they felt they were comfortable enough with to go speak to about their issues, about programming, about finding students like them. Now, when we did a focus group in 2014 and 2015, the needs are a little bit different. We see that Islamophobia is a huge issue. And Islamophobia is not only affecting our Muslim students, it's affecting our students that are not Muslim as well. For instance, you saw myself, I'm a Middle Eastern Christian who was thought to be a Muslim just because I'm Middle Eastern, right? So Islamophobia is this idea that there was no awareness of religious diversity in the Middle East, and also Islamophobia is a fear of Muslims, essentially, right? So a lot of our Muslim students are facing Islamophobia by their faculty and staff and students. Oh, you're Muslim, you're X, Y, and Z. And this is a huge issue on our college campus and probably across the UC system. Again, discrimination, harassment, and stereotyping has been an issue as well. And professional opportunities. I had about 120 graduating Middle Eastern students this year. And I cannot tell you about the number of students that are changing their name on their resume just so that they might get a job. Right? Anita Abdul Kareem is now Anita Kareem. Muhammad Abu Ramadan is now Mo Ramadan. Right? So they're trying to think of clever, creative ways to make their names more Americanized, and it's a huge issue. So we've since then created a bunch of professional opportunities. I'll talk about that a little bit more later. Another huge issue in the past year has been the refugee crisis. Call out to Syria right now. There's about maybe 4 million displaced Syrian refugees, and a lot of our students have come from Syria. They are refugees themselves, and their families are still in maybe Lebanon or in Jordan or in Syria, and they're facing a lot of issues in the Middle East, and they're taking these issues here with them as well. And now, of course, the conflict in the MENA region. The MENA is just short for Middle Eastern North African, and that's where we bring in Egypt, so North Africa. A lot of you are familiar with ISIS, I'm sure. A lot of you are familiar with different conflicts in the Middle East, and these conflicts are really affecting our students. I'm going to talk a little bit about our resources and programs and specific conflicts that we've discussed with our students and ways that you all can get involved and help our students as well. So let's talk about resources and programs. Now, of course, we want to cater to our student needs, right? We did all these focus groups, we created the center, so how are we going to support our students now? What we've done is we've created many programs and resources for our students and campus-wide events to educate our community about the Middle East. A few things include Cook With Me and Calligraphy With Me, and this is a really fun cooking demonstration. We brought in a Middle Eastern chef to teach students how to cook affordable Middle Eastern meals or Mediterranean meals. So hummus, we brought, I think they did like a mix on a Mediterranean Chipotle bowl. So trying to make students feel comfortable knowing that their food is now available on campus. We also had film screenings and discussions with various directors, a leadership retreat, professional panels and mixers. And this is where we invite professionals who are Middle Eastern from different disciplines. So let's say we had our engineering panel recently, and they were all Middle Eastern engineers, and they came and they provided various internship opportunities for our students. So now students have to worry, oh, my name is such and such, I'm not going to get a job, right? So we're trying to connect them with professionals as well. Now, student panel discussions have been an incredible part of the MESC. We have True Life, I'm a Middle Eastern man, and True Life, I'm a Middle Eastern Christian. Now, these are our two pilot programs for our student panel discussions. And I know Dr. Negar spoke briefly about the LGBT community or the LGB community in Iran. And at our Middle Eastern Man panel, we actually had one student who felt comfortable enough to come out at the panel in front of 75 students. So we are creating a more comfortable environment just by students being with the Middle Eastern community and knowing that someone is there to support their needs. They're starting to feel more comfortable. It's been an amazing experience. And we also have Emmy Week, which is Middle Eastern Week. It's a celebration of awareness and a celebration of the Middle East and the multiculturalism of the Middle East. And what we do is a full program, a full week of programs for the entire campus and community. This year we had Dr. Reza Aslan speak about Islamophobia and how it's affecting not only us in California and Muslims, but non-Muslims as well. Now, in terms of programs and resources, we have an alumni network, a community outreach program where we're pairing up Middle Eastern students with local refugees at different elementary schools and high schools and middle schools to help and mentor them. We also have a Middle Eastern Student Advisory Board who helps in programming for the MESC, a peer mentorship program, professional academic development funding, staff and faculty training, which Dr. Negar so graciously came to UCR and trained our staff and faculty about supporting the Middle Eastern community. Also student internships and student org advising, funding and programming, and of course tutoring. At UCR we have about 25 identified Middle Eastern orgs, and they're all able to access these programs and resources. Now I think my concern, or what I'm most interested in telling all of you, is how CAPS professionals can support this type of work, and what can you all do, what can you gain from this presentation today in terms of working with student affairs and working with the Middle Eastern community. Now, I'm assuming most of you don't have an MESC at your universities or don't know exactly how to access Middle Eastern students, but a lot of you are parts of universities that have cross-cultural centers and that have maybe specific centers that are starting to do outreach to Middle Eastern communities because they see that's been such an issue to support and outreach to them. So I know that our CAPS professionals, we have Liz Mondragon, who's the director of our CAPS at UCR. Her and her staff came to our candlelight vigil, and we had about 6 candlelight vigils this year to mourn the loss of plenty of victims who were killed on behalf of ISIS this year, to mourn the loss of the Chapel Hill victims. So our students came together and hosted candlelight vigils, and the counselors came to that to support the students in their mourning. We also have Mess Cafe with the MESC, which is simply a 1 hour a week. We have a coffee hour, and students get to select any topic they so choose. Now, topics have come up that students initiated about, of course, ISIS and conflicts in the MENA region, the headings of Egyptians in Libya, and the counselors did come to that to support our students as they were discussing their feelings and as they were discussing how these conflicts have made them feel. Also, we had a women's group during Mess Cafe, and they talked about where our parents went wrong, right? I'm sure the parents did a lot of good things as well, but a lot of our Middle Eastern women talked about self-esteem issues, talked about not being thin enough for their parents, not being beautiful enough, not being smart enough, not being desirable enough by a man to be married. So there's a lot of issues and various issues that are affecting Middle Eastern women at UCR. And during these coffee hours, it'd be incredible if CAPS professionals, if counselors and psychologists, if you so choose, were there to kind of discuss this, and it's almost a form of group therapy for the students. And I'm not sure if any of you have peer mentors, but through MESC and CAPS, we do have peer mentors. And I think what's great is to have the peer mentors meet and come together for mixers and socials, so that the students are mentoring each other and also become allies to the community. Another great idea is a professional panel. So an evening with CAPS professionals to explore career opportunities for students. A lot of our students are interested in becoming psychologists and counselors and being professors as well in psychology. So for all of them to get to meet 5 or 6 different CAPS professionals and see what you all are doing, how you all got there, and of course to build that alliance. And another great idea, I think, is a student organization meet and greet. So we have about 25 Middle Eastern orgs, and I'll be inviting our CAPS professionals to come to each one of their first general meetings to discuss, where's CAPS, how can we access their counselors and psychologists, and just to make sure that students know that CAPS professionals are available to them and they're there to support them and, of course, enhance their student experience. So these are just a few tips of things that you can replicate at your university and things that we're doing at UCR. And there's some students. Thank you all so much, and we're going to open up to questions if you have any.
Yes. Looks like we have a question. Yeah.
Just a quick question. First of all, it's really great, the work that you're doing. I'm curious what kind of staffing you have. You have such a wide range of programs
Right.
that you're offering. I'm really impressed with, I think, how many staff does it take to support that kind of program?
Yeah. It's just me right now as the director. I do have about 4 student interns, and I do have 1 administrative assistant. Ideally, I'd like to have 2 program coordinators eventually, but because we're such a brand new department, our funding isn't as robust as these other centers, so it's just myself as the professional staff and my 4 student interns. Yeah. But it's doable. If you have students who are actually dedicated and committed, they will do the work for the center. And they're so passionate about the programming and making the student experience better that they will work just as hard as you are, if not even more hard. So to make sure these programs are happening. Yeah. Do you have any other questions? Yeah.
You were talking about having professionals attend
Yeah.
general meetings and stuff. Is there
Right.
anything language-wise that you include? Because I feel like we normally will do the overview of services and
Yeah.
confidential and free.
Right.
Is there anything language-wise that you feel like kind of makes it more relevant to their life, aside from it just being like, oh yeah, CAPS is there?
I think what's really adorable and also really inviting and welcoming is when Arabic or Farsi is used in a presentation, like, oh, hi, everyone, like, ahlan, like, hello, just when CAPS professionals use specific words. I know that Liz has asked me, oh, so what are some words I can say? What are greetings that I can say in Arabic? And it's just kind of fun, depending on which club they're going to. Now, if you're going to the Iranian Student Association, you're not going to speak in Arabic, right? You'll speak in Farsi and learn a Farsi word. So things like that, they're just inviting, and it shows the students that this person does care about our culture and wants to hear about it and learn about it, and is interested enough to even pick up a few words before he or she came to our meeting. So things like that always help.
I think one thing I might add to that, but more specifically maybe with the international student population, is I think talking about CAPS services around enhancing their academic success might be an easier in terms of making that connection between mental health, academic wellness, and mental health very explicit. Might create a little bit more of a buy-in, especially with our international student population, but I think Middle Eastern student population in general, there's a strong cultural value around academic and career success, and I think that might that could be effective with a lot of students in terms of why are CAP services relevant to me? Why might I ever actually need them?
Mm-hmm.
Can you speak to how much do Middle Eastern students sort of feel like they have a shared identity, and again, sort of international Middle Eastern students versus Middle Eastern American
I think there's a very strong sense of shared identity. Even more so after 9/11, I think that increased a sense of shared identity. But there then are a lot of nuanced differences as well that I think there's some sensitivity around that not being understood. So Tina talked about the linguistic differences. So with the Iranian American population, that's a huge frustration that everyone assumes we speak Arabic or that we are Arabic, and it's a matter of pride to reiterate that we don't, right? But then there is a shared sort of sense of identity in terms of we might have different words for it, but it's all the same culture kind of underlying that. I think a lot of where the shared identity starts to split off is more around nationality than around culture.
Right.
You know, if you would add anything else.
I completely agree. And in terms of our data, we did not differentiate between international students and Middle Eastern Americans. It was simply those who identify as Middle Eastern at UC Riverside. So we didn't have the gap or the separation. In terms of shared identity, I do feel that our students, through this space, are working so hard to become allies to one another. So there is a huge shared identity for a woman who is Muslim to come and find out about a Middle Eastern woman who is Christian, to learn about that, for a Jewish male student to learn about a Muslim male student. There's a shared identity, and they're also becoming allies to one another. Despite some minute cultural differences or some large cultural differences, there's a shared identity because they feel like they're all in this together to reach out to those who don't understand them.
One other thing I want to add about our international student populations, because I think at the counseling center, because I do have an identifiably Iranian name, I think a lot of our international students from Iran gravitate to come to see me specifically. So I've interacted with quite a number of them clinically. I think in terms of the international student population, immigration-wise, there's a very strong desire to come here as an international student and stay. Is a big part of these students' broader plan that's very strong, I think, in the Middle Eastern community, because we're still kind of in the midst of one big wave of immigration. A lot of our international students who are coming here on student visas to study come here right off the bat with the plan of, I've got to find a job, I have to stay, and then I'm bringing my family. And that lends to a different acculturation process than international students who have a very clear intention to come here for their degree and return home. And I see that really strongly in the Iranian international student population, but the Middle Eastern student population in general, in terms of international students, that this opportunity to have come here to study internationally, what is their immigration story? We're right up on time for the vendor fair that I know everyone's excited to get to. But we'll be here if there's any specific questions, and we can answer one-on-one if there's more. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you.